Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. And when I was here for the first time, also I talked about Rowhammer and side channels. And the question is, why are we still talking about that so many years later? Why didn't we solve that problem, right? These are computers that we humans built. Why are we still discovering new flaws in those machines all the time? So this is what brought us to the idea of this talk, SQUIP, and why we need to study processors like nature, which is not necessarily intuitive because, yeah, that's a thing that humans built. Why would we study it like things from nature? That's not really intuitive. Yeah, the first thing that we want to tell you is side channels are everywhere. Yeah. And maybe some of you now have the tune already ringing.
Side channels are everywhere, most of the time we're unaware, but first it's no leaking on.
Yeah, exactly. It has a nice earworm. And then the next thing that we thought we should actually also tell you, so side channels are everywhere. This is something that really should stick with you, right? The other thing, to also substantiate that, I wanted to make a slide where I break all the rules that I usually give to students. And that is having only text on slides and having a lot of text on slides. Here it is. You don't need to read it. This is just a list of side channels that we have seen over the past few years. And you can see that there's a lot of things that you can do with side channels. So we were wondering about mitigations. What's the situation there, right? If there are so many attacks. So I did a Google search. Typed in here, provable side channel mitigation. And yeah, I have 3,000 results. That's not bad, provable side channel mitigation. And then if you plot this over the years, it looks like this. And this was actually nice. This was generated with ChatGPT. But with actual data, actually. But we get more and more side channel mitigations, provable side channel mitigations, basically. Problem solved, right? Yes.
Not really.
Not really?
Not really, no.
Okay,
no.
yeah.
I don't believe that.
I can do a second Google search, right? Let's search for side channel attacks. See, only 1,000 results.
But that's only for 1 year.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe the situation is not so good. So why are we in this situation with provably secure mitigations? Why don't we have really good side channel mitigations? The problem is if you want to mitigate attacks, you very often have to model the system that you're studying. And in security, very often, model and reality diverge a bit. So why do we have to study this like nature? Systems are getting more and more complex, right? If I have a very small system, I can model that. And then I can study that and figure out and reason about it. Maybe I can prove something about the system. But the systems that we're building are reaching the complexity of nature. And this is just way beyond the capabilities that we have when building models. And actually, there was a book that's already quite old by Herbert Simon, The Sciences of the Artificial. And this is I'm not talking about pseudosciences here. This is artificial sciences, not pseudosciences. The idea is that natural sciences only apply to nature, not something artificial that humans build, because it doesn't make any sense. So why would you study it with the same methodology? Because things are getting so complex that we can't fully reason about those systems anymore. And that means we follow this typical methodology from natural science with question and then a hypothesis, a question like what could happen in this situation, hypothesis, maybe the processor does this, then a prediction, if the processor does this, then we will see this behavior, maybe a timing difference. Then we can test whether we see this timing difference. We can analyze whether this matches our initial hypothesis and question, and then at the end compare with other research results whether this works and whether this fits into the broader context. So we are really studying these things like nature. SQUIP is just one more example that we have in this direction, and we will start this to show you how this process works with a processor pipeline. So let's take a look at a processor pipeline. Here we see the front end. This is of an AMD Zen CPU.
Zen 2, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have seen side channel attacks here on the front end, on the instruction cache, on the micro tags. Here we have more parts of the pipeline. Anything interesting here? Yeah, we have the reorder buffer somewhere here, so that's directly below, right?
Quite a lot that has been exploited also in the past. Yes.
Load and store queues, they have been exploited, right? In zombie load, we attacked those. We have, here's the reorder buffer up there. We have here the execution ports. We had port contention, for instance. Port contention was also a side channel. And then, of course, down here in the memory subsystem, we have the L1 cache, we have the TLB, and a lot more if we go further down memory lane, right? Yes.
Can you go back a little bit?
Oh yeah, sure.
Maybe yes.
Here?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's something that looks a little bit different on AMD than, for example, on Intel.
Oh yeah.
So if you can show at the blocked area. This one, yes. So these are the scheduler queues on.
Right.
On
this
AMD.
down here, this is the execution ports, right? This is what has been attacked so far. This hasn't been attacked so far.
Yeah, because it wasn't very interesting so far.
Yeah, well, but then we can build a new attack with that.
Yeah.
That's how we start, right? Just pick an element, no one attacked this so far, let's attack it. Great. So, then we thought, well, let's ask ChatGPT. Hey, ChatGPT, can you please provide us with suggestions for a name for a new side channel? We're probing the scheduler queue. Make it a nice acronym that sounds like a real word. Sure, here are 5 suggestions. SQUIP, Squint, SQPro, SQMap, SQUIP. Scheduler queue usage interference probing, best. Why is SQUIP the best name? Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Lastly, SQUIP is a palindrome. Oh yeah, that's a good point. SQUIP is a palindrome. That's why people will like it. So this is what we chose. SQUIP, scheduler queue usage interference probing. Great, here's our new text. Yeah. Wait a second. Something we learned over the years is when we do new research, we should first check whether it already exists. And of course, we don't want to Google this anymore. We just ask ChatGPT, hey, we found something new, we call it SQUIP, side channel, anything you know about this? I doubt that the SQUIP side channel is actually new. I have heard of similar concepts in the past that dealt with the contention of resources rather than anything related to quantum computers.
What?
For example, there was a group of penguins in Antarctica that were known to hoard fish and create contention among them. And I recall a 60s or 70s German TV show called Der siebte Sinn that featured an episode discussing similar ideas. Who knows this show? All right. So let's download this one.
In der modernen Welt der Prozessortechnik verfügen die hochentwickelten Rechenmaschinen über mehrere Ausführungseinheiten, die Operationen wie Multiplikationen und Speicheroperationen grundsätzlich parallel zueinander verrichten können. Aber Obacht, denn auch bei dieser parallelen Abwicklung bedarf es einer gewissen Koordination, welche Einheit der Rechenmaschine von welcher Operation gerade in Anspruch genommen werden darf. AMD setzt hierbei auf eigens konstruierte Verzögerungsspuren, auf welchen die Operationen verweilen dürfen, bis die entsprechenden Ausführungseinheiten und zugehörigen Eingabewerte zur Verfügung stehen. Soll eine Operation aus dem Anweisungsstrom zu einer bestimmten Ausführungseinheit, wie hier links im Bilde dargestellt, so muss sie sich in die passende Verzögerungsspur einfädeln. Andere Operationen, die zu einer anderen Ausführungseinheit gelangen müssen, können indes weiter der aktuellen Spur folgen, bis sie die geeignete Ausführungseinheit erreichen. Die Verzögerungsspur pro Ausführungseinheit erhöht auf diese Weise die Durchlaufgeschwindigkeit der Operationen. Gleichwohl diese Lösung anmutig erscheint, kann sie in der Praxis durchaus an ihre Schranken gelangen. Sollte die Verzögerungsspur etwa für den akuten Operationsandrang unterdimensioniert sein, so kann dies ungünstige Effekte auf sämtliche Operationen haben, selbst jene, die zu anderen Ausführungseinheiten gelangen müssen, wie hier im Bilde zu erblicken. Aus sicherheitstechnischer Perspektive ist dies heikel, denn ein potenzieller Angreifer könnte auf diese Weise eruieren, wie viele Operationen zu welcher Ausführungseinheit unterwegs sind.
All right, so. Well, apparently they had it in a TV show, but there was no paper about it yet, so we wrote a paper. So what do? Let's maybe go back to this example and look at it in more detail.
Yes. Our goal here is to build a situation that is quite similar to this. So we have a few operations here represented by these nice cars that have to go to the left. And we have a few operations that want to pass just straight through. I will come back to this figure later. So remember it. It's
just a basic idea.
Why do we want to do that? Suppose we have an attacker and a victim. Both of them run on the same physical core, but on different hyperthreads. And the attacker has no architectural access to the victim. But the attacker wants to observe when the victim performs certain operations. In our case, we are interested in multiplications, so that we can later on break stuff like square and multiply. How do we do this? We use a timing side channel. So the attacker creates something that gives a timing signal that is different whenever the victim performs a multiplication. We have to remember some principles so that we understand the attacks. So first of all, a brief recap about out-of-order executions. So we have 3 instructions in the program, one after the other, but that's not how the processor executes them. If you have a look at the instructions, then you see, well, okay, the first one is a slow memory load, and the second instruction, it depends on that load. But the third one is totally independent. So what the CPU does, well, it just reorders them. So because the third instruction is independent, the CPU can just execute it while the slow load is running, or even before. This can be a problem if we want to measure execution times. So, for example, there's this RDTSC instruction on Intel and also on AMD, which you can use to read the timestamp counter, which increments in a periodic fashion. So that's one way to do it, or you can use the RDPLU instruction, which is a little bit more precise on AMD. But because there's this out-of-order execution thing, this requires some measures that you prevent the reordering of these instructions. And this is typically done by using serializing instructions or fences. But what happens if we don't do that? We don't want to do this. Keep that in mind for the following steps. So we also have to understand how such a CPU pipeline works. So we have these 2 instruction streams. They come from the 2 hyperthreads the CPU supports. They get to the front end. The front end decodes them into a thing that is called microops. So the x86 instruction set is quite complex. So in order to deal with more complex instructions efficiently, they are split up into micro operations. And for example, on Zen 2, it looks like this. So we have the microops. They come to the retire control unit, and the retire control unit just forwards them to these scheduler queues, and the scheduler queues then decide, depending on whether the corresponding execution unit, which are here, it decides whether, it decides on, based on whether the execution unit is ready and the input operands are ready, which of these micro operations to execute next. One interesting thing here is that these execution units here, they are not equal. So there are some execution units that are specialized in doing specific operations. For example, on AMD, there's only one execution unit that is available for multiplications.
That is on Zen 2, right? On Zen 3, it looks a bit different, but still, you can use the same trick then.
Yes.
All right. And so you have these scheduler queues. They have a certain size, right? So how do we then exploit that?
Well, the question here is what happens if such a queue is full, and how does this forwarding from the retire control unit to the scheduler queues work in general? So here's the simple case. So we have a queue that is almost full, but not full yet. So the retire control unit can just forward the multiplication to the corresponding queue, and after that it can continue with the next operation. In that case, it's an RDPRU instruction.
And so you see an earlier timing because RDPRU now was executed immediately.
Yes.
But what about the other case?
The other case, and probably the more interesting case is, well, okay, what happens if the queue is already full? So in that case, obviously the multiplication can't be forwarded to the scheduler queue.
What does the processor do then?
Well, what can it do?
Stop.
I mean, at this stage here, so this forwarding stage, there's no way for the processor to reorder, because that's what the scheduler is all about.
So that means this will not be executed, and that means the timing will be much slower.
Yeah, because the RDPRU now has to wait until there's some empty place in the scheduler queue again. So we can code that. It's just a few assembly instructions. First of all, we drain the scheduler queue. We want to start with an empty queue so that we have precise control about how many microops are in there.
But in the end, you want to fill the queue, actually.
Yes.
What do you do in between then?
Well, just how do I fill that? I just use some multiplications that are dependent on each other. So.
But even if they are dependent on each other, if they are processed really fast, they would disappear.
So
right?
typically a multiplication only takes about 3 or 4 cycles. So that's.
So how do you make sure that they don't disappear?
Just make them dependent on something that's really slow. For example, like calculating some square roots or something like that. And okay, what can we do as well? We are interested in the timing of that.
Yes.
So yeah, just add one timer read
and another
one, and that's basically it. So what does it do? As soon as we exceed, well, normally, if we don't exceed the scheduler queue capacity, then what do we see? Well, the second RDPU instruction will be executed immediately because of out-of-order execution. But if we exceed it, then we observe this pipeline stall, and we see a large difference between the first and the second RDPU.
Maybe we can visualize that again, so that it's really clear.
Remember from the illustration from before, we have this crossing here, and we have a left turn lane and a straight ahead lane. So yeah, that's basically our scheduler queues. So the left one is for the multiplications, and the straight ahead is for everything else. What do we do now? Well, okay, we just turn the traffic lights to red, and we have some cars, in our case, the instructions. In the first case, well, okay, we see the second RDPU can just continue. And in the other case, if we fill up the queue completely, then the subsequent RDPU has to wait because it can't pass the multiplication.
So if we do this on a real processor now and measure the timing, it will look like this.
Something like this. So we see that for Zen 2 at 16 multiplications, that's the limit. After that, we see a steep increase of this timing difference. And on Zen 3, we see the same steep increase between 22 and 23 microoperations.
If you look at the green line, though, this also has to go up at some point.
At some point, but a very later point, because at some point even the big Intel scheduler is filled up.
Yeah. We also looked at this on the Apple M1 processor, which is also an alternative design now. And this, interestingly, has a similar design choice there as the AMD CPUs with split scheduler queues.
So one problem there was, well, okay, we don't have a timer that has such a high resolution, but that problem can be easily solved because if we want a larger timing difference, then we just delay the multiplications even more. And in that case, it means, well, okay, we just use more square roots.
But also they have a few more scheduler queues. It's split up a bit differently, right?
It looks a little bit different, yes, but it's...
we can just, if we fill all of those queues, then we can still attack it.
Basically the same, and it also works on the Apple M1.
Yeah. So how do we use that in an attack?
So remember what we want to do is we want to observe when the victim performs some multiplications. We first test this by using a very simple sender and a very simple receiver. So in the receiver, we basically just sample our measurement over time. And in the sender, well, we just send a 1 for a specific amount of time and a 0 for a specific amount of time. For 0, we just execute 50 knobs, and for 1, we just execute 15 multiplications, and we do that in a loop. And what we see by doing that is a really nice signal where we can clearly distinguish the ones from the zeros. And this is on Zen 2, on Zen 3. It's a little bit more noisy, but it still works.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is basically then you can build a real covert channel on top of that, of course, where you do a bit more work, a bit more of preamble, post-fix processing.
Yeah.
Post. Yeah.
Here you can see it in action. So we started the receiver, we start the sender, and as you can also see, it's quite fast. So and also with only also quite reliable. Here it's only a single bit of error, and that's basically just the last bit that's missing.
Yeah, this is a rather short message, but we also did this for a lot of more data, and there we also measured the bandwidth, and they are quite good, right?
It's in the cross process case we are at 2.7 megabits per second in the cross VM setting. It's a little bit more difficult because we have more noise due to virtualization overhead, and we also don't have the RDTSC instruction and so on. But we still managed to make it work, and yeah, it's also quite decent with more than 800 kilobits per second.
This also works on SEV, which is particularly interesting because SEV is this secure virtual machine technology on AMD, and also there it's no problem to communicate across secure virtual machine boundaries. Another part that we looked at it was a side channel attack, and there we just did the standard square and multiply attack that you might be familiar with. Where for each exponent,
the interesting what we exploited there was basically for 0 in the secret key we have to perform less multiplications than for 1. And we recorded the signal over time again. We repeated that multiple times. We did some normalization of the length of the traces, summed them up. We also performed a few warm-up rounds to basically to just stabilize the CPU frequency. And then what we get is something like this, where you can clearly see where you can clearly distinguish the ones as peaks in our signal, and for the zeros, you basically just measure the distance between the ones.
Yeah, and with that you get the full RSA key out of that trace.
And we also evaluated that in a cross-process setting and in a cross-VM setting. We get quite a low error rate out of that, and we can record that these traces in about 40 minutes or so.
Yeah, so if we have all these attacks now, so it's yet another side channel, right? So how do we mitigate it?
Well, there are quite a few options. None of them is ideal. So the first idea is, what do we attack? We attack these split scheduler queues. So what if we just have one scheduler queue like Intel does? Problem here is, it might be a little bit more power hungry. Another idea might be, just make all these execution units that are attached to a scheduler, make them symmetric. The problem here is, it's first of all, it might also be energy hungry, and the other cases, of course, it might be a little bit difficult to just throw 4 multiplication units onto the same chip. Probably also not the best idea.
Yeah. So what are more practical solutions?
I mean, we could just try to use stricter partitioning in the scheduler queues. meaning that, well, okay, one thread is allowed to use at most half of the overall capacity.
But that is not really great, because that basically eliminates the advantage of having hyperthreading.
Yeah, and
you could even do that in software, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
Disable hyperthreading.
So we can probably disabling hyperthreading completely is not too good, but we can use it more. We can do that more more targeted, so that we maybe use something like co-scheduling or core scheduling, where basically it's not allowed for two threads from different security domains to execute on the same core at the same time.
Yeah, but this is not great, right? We found a new side channel, and yeah, it's also still there, right? Side channels are still everywhere, and the question is, how can we solve this? As we said in the beginning, the models and actual CPUs, the complexity there is diverging. Just think about it. Who develops those models of processors for security purposes? Those will be teams of researchers, maybe a single researcher, maybe 10 researchers, maybe 20 researchers. And building a model takes time, right? On the other side, you have hundreds and thousands of engineers working on actual CPUs. And if everyone builds a component and then these components are put together, this complexity multiplies. So you have a much stronger growth in complexity for the actual processors than you have for the models. And we can't win this ever. This will be impossible. So that means we have to work with the future where side channels will become more prevalent, and we need to find ways how to secure our systems despite having side channels everywhere. It doesn't mean that models and formal method research on side channels is not worth anything, right? It still has value, because we understand more parts and know which parts we can protect, which things to avoid. We still learn something from it, but we have to be aware that the future will always hold more of this and more side channels, and we will not ever win this fight. All right, this basically gets us to our conclusion. Closing a side channel, well, increases security. Yeah, so it's not in vain to find a side channel and then close it, right? But at the same time, as we've just seen today, there's always another side channel. Even if you close the cache side channel with some secure cache.
You close one and you get 3 new. So
yes. And some of these side channels, we've also seen that it's not really clear how we should mitigate it, because if we mitigate it, we lose the advantage that it brings. A lot of side channels are very tightly coupled to the advantages, the performance benefits that you gain. If you want to get rid of the side channel, you lose the advantage. Another point that we want to have as a takeaway of this talk, computers are complex and constantly become more complex, and this is not going in the other direction. We are not heading back to less complex computers. And this also applies to not just single computers, but also computer systems and systems in general. Systems only get more complex over time. Yeah, that means we need to keep studying processors like we study nature. And we are well aware that we will never reach this 100% goal of, oh, now it will be 100% secure. We will never reach that, the same way as we will never reach a 100% understanding of nature. But if we find those channels early as possible, then maybe we prevent exploitation in some cases. And with that, we would like to thank you for your attention.